So in this segment, we'll take a slightly more detailed dive into the guidance from Singapore about AI and ML medical devices. So this is the document. This is the recently issued document from Singapore, the Health Science Authority. You see the title is called Regulatory Guidelines for Software Medical Devices, a Life Cycle Approach. This is a relatively short document. It's about 30 pages and covers almost every topic required in this area. So it's well recommended for students if you want to read one document that covers everything. This is an excellent summary. What we'll focus here is on section 8, which is pages 25 to 29 of this document. And this breaks into three subsections. 8.1, regulatory requirements for AI-MD, artificial intelligence medical devices, basically software that uses artificial intelligence algorithms. Subsection 2, which is additional considerations for AI-MD with continuous learning capabilities, the ability systems that learn from data and update as they go on, and then some issues about post-market monitoring of these devices in section 8.3. So these are the regulatory requirements for AI-MD in general, the high level. They're the same as for regular medical software plus. So here, let me just back up and say, by same, I mean the same issues about quality management systems, risk management, proper design, verification, validation, all of those things are implied. What we're going to show here is the extra things that apply specifically to this AI-MD, or what the document calls AI-MD software. So it's the same as for regular medical software plus issues to do with continuous learning capabilities, a specification of the level of human intervention is an algorithm that works together with a human, and then specification of the details about how models are trained and retrained. Those are kinds of the things that they would like extra information about, in addition to all the usual things you need for all kinds of medical software. So what type of pre-market submission information is required? So pre-market submission information, this is the information that's required when you submit your application to a regulatory agency to get permission to go to market. This is the regulatory approval process effectively. They would like information about the data set that you use to train the algorithm, the model that's used, the F function if you wish, the performance and clinical evaluation that was performed. They would like extra information about how this thing is going to be deployed, and they would like a specification of the process for continuous learning, if applicable. Remember the FDA's guidance on the pre-specification and the algorithm change protocol. This is the equivalent here. So let's take a look at this one at a time. So first look at the data set. You can follow along in my table down here on the bottom left. They would like to know what the input data and the features used to generate the corresponding output. They would like to know what the pre-processing that was done and if it's required for new data. And they would like details about the source, the size, the attribution of the training, validation, and test data sets. So training is the data set that gets used to create the model. Validation is the initial thing that gets used to tune parameters. And test in this vocabulary is the actual data set that was used to do the final performance evaluation. They would like to know how the labeling and the annotation was done. They would like to make sure that there is no duplication in training and validation data sets, otherwise you get contamination. They would like you to want to specify the rationale for the appropriateness and the adequacy of the dataset. Why was this dataset selected? Is it adequate for the target population? And they would like to know if any factors that can potentially influence the output results. Are there particular datasets or particular ethnic groups in which this algorithm fails? The next step, and I will keep this very short, is the model. And here they would like you to document the model and what is the base model. This is based on the unit, and then we tweak something. And they would like the company, the manufacturer, to justify why this model was chosen. The evaluation comes next. Then this is where we have to specify the test protocol and report for verification and validation of the software, and any control measures to detect outliers. There's always outliers in data. How do we detect these outliers and say, well, in this data set it would fail? For example, when you take MRI images, if you have a patient has dental fillings, this can actually affect the quality of the image, especially if these are metallic, and may render the image useless for an algorithm. So we have to be able to detect this thing, call them an outlier, and say the algorithm doesn't apply here. They would like to know the performance measures, for example, the sensitivity and specificity that we talked about in week 9, and the clinical association between the output and the clinical conditions. And again, this harkens back to the general validation strategy that we talked about in week 10 when we talked about validation. Then comes deployment, and this is where things begin to get even more challenging. They would like to a clear specification of the workflow and how the output should be used. Is there human intervention? How much and when? Is this a first reading and the human checks it? Is the human does the reading first and the algorithm checks, gives a confirmatory reading? Does the human look at the output of the algorithm and then use it as part of their assessment? So those are the kinds of things. And they would like to have a sense of the interval for training data update cycle is months or years. So often with these algorithms, we train on 500 datasets or 1,000 datasets. The algorithm gets approved, it goes to market. We continue to collect data, and then hopefully in a year or two or months, a few months, we may be able to release a newer model that gives you improved performance as we acquire more data. So this is the kind of thing they would like information on. And finally, this very thorny issue of continuously learning systems. They would like a description of the process, much like the FDA guidance. They would like to have to be a safety mechanism in place to detect and mitigate anomalies. Anomalies are things that trip the algorithm in the output. And we want to ensure that there's no introduction of bias. So the inclusion and exclusion criteria should be identical to the original training dataset. And here's what concretely this means. Let's say you train your algorithm, you ensure 50% male, 50% female participation in the original training data, so you don't have bias across sexes. Now, as you acquire new data, you have a continuous learning mechanism. Let's say that you all of a sudden have a lot more men in these new data sets. This could create a bias in the algorithm. So you have to make sure that as new data is acquired, we keep to the same criteria and balancing as the original training data set. And we have to ensure that data integrity, reliability, and validity of the new training set is maintained, that this is a controlled process and everything is done carefully. A second set of requirements here, and this becomes particularly important, especially for using cloud systems, is to allow for rollback to a previous version of the model. So this is to manage the risk involved in a decentralized model if this is used. And what is meant by that here is, let's say that the algorithm is applied in a cloud system, and at some point you update the model in the cloud. The hospital doesn't necessarily know that it has been updated, and all of a sudden they get interesting results, strange results, bad performance. They want to have the ability to roll back to the previous version just to stay sane and not get confused. And this is a key problem of management risk in this type of decentralized situation. The other requirement here is to have traceability between the real-world data for training, learning processes, system version number, and the output during clinical use. So traceability means that for any given data set or any given result, we'd like to know what the data that was used for training, what was the process, what was the system version number. So we have the ability to audit the system. So if something goes wrong, we know, well, version 8.1 was problematic. We need to roll back to version 8.0. And finally, the usual verification and validation activities to ensure that performance stays within the predefined bounds, which means that if you learn a new model, you may need to reapply it on the previous test data to make sure that we don't have performance drift. The last statement here has to do with post-market monitoring of AI-MD, and as we talked in week 10 when we talk about deployment and maintenance, medical software is not just something that's released into the world and forgotten. We have to monitor its performance and ensure that it's operating correctly and make any necessary interventions if things start going wrong. So the companies are required to monitor real-world performance, and they must have a plan to measure traceability and monitor and review the performance in a clinical setting, in the real world. And they need to have a robust system in place to prevent drift, especially if new data sets are introduced or if we have retraining. So to conclude, this is an area that's in its infancy. This is an area that produces huge challenges to regulators. We have techniques we don't really understand. They have a huge amount of promise. And the challenge for all of us in this field is to figure out techniques, rules, regulations, guidelines, controls to make this technology safe to ultimately be able to benefit patients and improve the treatment and diagnosis of patients in the real world. With that, we conclude this discussion of regulatory guidance. In the next segment, Professor John Onofre will come in and talk to us about the practical aspects of how AI/ML impacts the medical software lifecycle. Thank you.